Here's how to make sourdough without ever using a recipe again. This tutorial is geared toward those who have baked a couple of loaves and understand the basic principles of sourdough, because I'm going to get into the more technical aspects and cover how each one affects your loaf. So basically, we're going to cover everything you ever wanted to know about sourdough. If there's one thing I wish I understood 6 years ago when I started, it's baker's percentages. Baker's percentages are the ratios of flour, water, salt, and yeast in your recipe. So you can create your own sourdough recipe as long as you understand these principles. The easiest way to remember baker's percentages is to think everything is based on the flour. Let's say that you're going to use 500 grams of flour in your bread recipe. The water or hydration level can range from 60% for a stiffer, drier dough, all the way up to 85% for a very loose, wet dough. For this purpose, we'll use 70%. So you're going to move the decimal over and multiply 0.70 by 500, giving you 350 grams of water. Pretty easy, right? We'll talk later about how the amount of water affects the final dough and the crumb, but for now, let's just keep going with the equations. So we have 500 grams of flour. Let's figure out how much starter we're going to add. Typically, recipes will range from 10% starter for a dough that will take longer to ferment and ultimately have a more sour flavor, all the way up to 20% for a dough that will proof much faster and have a much more mild flavor. That might seem counterintuitive. More starter should mean more sour flavor, right? I'll get into this later, but for now, let's just work out the math. So we'll go right in the middle and choose 15%. Let's move the decimal over 2 places and multiply 0.15 by 500, giving us 75 grams of starter for this recipe. Salt can also affect the fermentation time and final flavor. I like to stick to 2%, but you can experiment a little bit and see what you like. So 2% of 500 is 10 grams. So let's add all of our numbers together and we'll get the final weight of our loaf before baking. 500 plus 350 plus 75 plus 10 gives us a loaf of 935 grams. That's a pretty standard sized loaf, but remember, it's going to lose a lot of that water weight through steam during the bake. So in the end, it will be a much lighter loaf. I hope that makes sense. Just remember to move the decimal over 2 places and multiply by the amount of flour. So we've got our baker's percentages down. However, understanding how each of these ingredients and variables affects the final dough is really important and will ultimately make this process even simpler. So not all flour is created equal. If you look at the nutrition label, you'll notice that all-purpose flour has a lower protein content than whole wheat or bread flour. It also has less gluten, which are the chains that form to make your bread chewy and also give the dough strength to expand without breaking. Think of a muffin or a piece of cake, how it has a soft, crumbly texture. Now think of pizza dough, how you almost have to tear it with your teeth. That's because pizza dough is made with a higher protein flour. You can make a loaf with just all-purpose flour. It's just going to take a little bit longer for the gluten to develop, but your final result is going to be a much softer loaf. You can also use all bread flour and everything will come together faster. The gluten will develop more quickly, but your final result is going to be a little bit chewier. There are some benefits to mixing a lower protein flour like all-purpose with a higher protein flour like whole wheat. Where the all-purpose flour gives the bread a softer interior, the whole wheat flour gives your loaf strength. Another important thing to remember is that different flours absorb different amounts of water. The higher the protein, the more water that flour is going to absorb. So if you typically do a 70% hydration loaf using only all-purpose flour, that same percentage is going to result in a much drier, stiffer dough than you're used to if you switch to bread or whole wheat flour, because it's going to soak up a lot more water. And vice versa, if you do 75% with all bread flour, and then you try to use that much water with all-purpose, you're probably going to notice that the dough is a lot wetter and looser than you are normally used to working with. And that's because the all-purpose isn't absorbing the water like the bread flour does. Water will also affect the internal crumb of your loaf. So if you want something with like big open holes, you're going to want to try a higher hydration. Less water is going to result in a little bit more of a dense, tighter crumb. When it comes to water, you not only want to pay attention to the amount, but also the temperature. And the more water you use in a recipe, the faster your dough is going to ferment. The same goes for temperature. So the warmer your water, the faster fermentation happens. If you want to slow down that process, you'll want to lower the temperature of your water. Your starter is so important. Probably the most vital ingredient in the recipe. So it's really important that you have an understanding of how it works and that you are familiar with yours in particular. If you don't, I have a video that covers all of that. I'll link it at the end. Basically, you want to make sure that your starter is at peak maturity. So from the last feeding, it should have tripled in volume and still be maintaining that volume. This is when the yeast activity is highest. The other thing to note is the more starter you use, the more active yeast you're introducing, and the faster they will eat the sugars in the flour, which is what ferments or proofs your dough quickly. If you use less starter, the process is slowed down a bit, giving the dough more time to ferment, which will result in a stronger, more sour flavor. The way you mix your dough or develop the gluten is also going to affect the temperature. So I like to do a hand mix and then a series of stretch and folds or coil folds. This isn't really going to affect the temperature too much. On the other hand, if you're kneading your dough or using a high-speed mixer, that friction is going to create heat, so you'll probably want to use colder water. Right now at the bakery, we're hand mixing sourdough, but we make baguettes every morning in the stand mixer, and for those, we use ice water. For the sourdough, we use a much warmer water, about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's because it's very gently mixed by hand. We're not introducing more heat. If anything, it's going to cool down as it comes to room temperature in the kitchen, and we are just allowing the gluten to develop more gently over time. The last ingredient I want to cover is salt. So salt will slow down fermentation. So obviously the more salt you use, the slower it's going to ferment. But I wouldn't use this as a way to slow down or speed up the process. You just want to use the right amount of salt. And as I mentioned, for me, that's about 2%. You can adjust this slightly to your preference and just use this knowledge as a way to troubleshoot if something went wrong. With that in mind, let's circle back to the flavor you'll get from a dough that has fermented longer versus one that has proofed quite quickly. Basically, more time equals more sour, less time equals less sour. So the intensity of flavor is more based on time than it is the amount of starter that you use. So if you want a more sour loaf, there's a couple things that you can try. Personally, I would probably pull the starter all the way back to 10% and give that dough a longer bulk ferment on the counter. So if my normal time is 4 hours from initial mix to final shape, I'm going to try and stretch that out to about 6 hours. Alternatively, you can keep the same starter amount that you normally use and add colder water, and that will also slow down the fermentation time. The other one is salt. If you add more salt, that's going to slow down fermentation. But like I said, you don't want to end up with like a super salty loaf. So I would not do that. 2%. I think 2% is perfect. Now that you have all of this knowledge, I challenge you to find your perfect base recipe. You don't even have to make one up. You can just take the one that you're already using and do the math to figure out the baker's percentages. And I know that restraint can be difficult, especially when you have all of this new information, but try your best to just tweak one thing at a time and then record the difference. Because if you change too many variables and then bake a loaf, you won't really know which effect each one had. And if you've made it this far, congratulations. You know so much more than I did when I first started making sourdough. If you have any questions, drop them below. And if you still don't have a sourdough starter, don't buy one. I have a video linked below that shows you exactly how to make one with just flour and water in less than 10 days. If you'd like a more in-depth video of the sourdough process as far as technique, I'll have that out next week. Happy baking. I'll see you next time.